Welcome to another episode of History Lab Live. I'm Tamsin Peach. This time we're at the launch of a book called Fringe to Famous. The conversation you'll hear is not about selling out. It's not about keeping it pure. It's about the untidy, productive, cross-pollinating relationships between fringe scenes and mainstream culture. The way music bleeds into comedy into film, streetwear into fine art. And it's about how those exchanges have shaped Australian cultural life since the 1980s. But it's also a book with an argument about the present and the future, about what kinds of policy settings, institutions and infrastructures we actually need if we want creative life to keep flourishing here in Australia. Two of the book's co-authors are cultural historians Tony Moore and Mark Gibson, and they've spent years interviewing the people who actually lived the transition. Musicians, comedians, designers and filmmakers, and researching the conditions that made it possible. With them is artist and Mental as Anything founding member Reg Mombassa, and there's also a guest appearance from television creator Paul Fenech. Academic and journalist Catharine Lumby hosts the lively discussion, which was recorded on Gadigal land at Sydney's Glee Books.
Look, it's a genuine honour and a privilege to be here with two of my closest buddies, Tony Moore and Mark Gibson, to launch the paperback edition of Fringe to Famous, which they co-authored with McAuliffe and Maura, Edmond. It is an important and necessary book on so many levels. It takes us on a journey from the 1970s, when I was sitting on the Newcastle Girls High School hockey field dreaming of the exit sign, I can tell you, when cool shit was happening and I wasn't there, to now in the cultural sector, and explains, using, importantly, deep interviews and in-depth case studies to explain how offbeat, fringe, grassroots movements, crazy ideas in music, performance, film, design, comedy, gaming, how these things cross over into the mainstream. How does that work? And I'm looking at my friend Jessie Jensen Cole. Shout out for Jessie's book on Circus Oz, From the Pram to Circus Oz. Buy that too, right? You're welcome. You know, how this stuff crosses over. And one of the things the book does, really importantly, is it knocks some shibboleths on the head. The romantic 70s idea, worthy as it was, you know, that as David Williamson once told me when I interviewed him for a book that I've just finished, that everyone should be paid the same regardless of talent, right? This is a pram factory concept. Okay, well, my darling husband, Larry Meltzer, who's in the audience, was in the pram factory performing Marxist acrobatics at the time. Now, he is a fabulous filmmaker and photographer, but I wouldn't pay to see him perform Bertolt Brecht or do a human pyramid. So it's very interesting that, you know, part of the book looks back to the 70s and to some romantic worthy ideas about the way in which the fringe was opposed to the mainstream. But it I hate that word deconstructs. It interrogates the opposition in a very sophisticated way, I think. And it's also a book that critiques the idea that culture can and should be measured solely by economic value. Screw that. Or other bullshit corporate speak measures. You know, we're all familiar with corporate speak and we're over it. It's a book that shows how some of our best and brightest artists, one included on this panel, writers, designers, directors and performers have worked in the in-between space. Like how you find your way, you crawl in through those crevices. And that the fact that culture doesn't live or breathe as an either-or entity. I'm also excited to launch this book because Tony Moore and Mark Gibson are two of my closest colleagues and friends, and I have learned so much from both of them. Tony and I worked in the media before succumbing to academia. He's from the Gong and I'm from Newcastle. Enough bloody said, to quote my nana after her fifth schooner. Mark is from a slightly more cultivated background, but one of the wonderful things is that he understands why class matters and why it needs to become part of the identity politics conversation again. That's me talking, but I think these guys agree. But the really important thing for me, the reason I love working with Mark and Tony is that they both make me laugh, particularly at myself. And that's my definition of collegiality. So I'm going to Q&A and we're going to talk for a bit and we're going to leave, I reckon, 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So let me begin. Tony, take us through the main argument of Fringe to Famous. What do you mean by negotiated hybridity? How does the Fringe impact popular culture?
Well, I guess we're saying mixing up can be fun, mixing up different things. So hybridity, a bit of a buzzword, but we live in a time when everything's being essentialised. You know, this is my essential identity. And I guess I've always been interested in people and things and art that cross borders, that isn't just this is my position and that's it. And with Fringe to Famous, I guess it started with noting that so much good music in the 1980s and 1990s, indeed the late 70s, had its origins in fringe formations. When I say fringe formations, you can use words like countercultures, subcultures, scenes, but think about places shaped by the Sydney Trade Union Club, independent record stores, import record stores, 4ZZZ radio, what an academic called Pierre Bourdieu called the field of limited production. What that meant was scenes where you know everyone, most of the people in it are making stuff and doing interesting things, and you bounce ideas around. And there were certainly scenes in music, comedy, art in Sydney, in Melbourne, in the late 70s, early 80s, as there were which is in another book, which hopefully is for sale in this store called Dancing with Empty Pockets about Bohemians, was going on from the 1860s in Australia. That is, in this country, people that were in kind of critical, iconoclastic, wicked, often evil but fun comic groups, art movements, musical groups wanted to make money. They wanted to have more than just a small number of fans, and it was often for egalitarian reasons. They didn't just want to be talking to a phone booth full of people. And Fringe to Famous started with that observation and said, but hey, wait a minute, most of the policy talk avoids this. And a lot of academics who are examining this talk about anyone that's an artist that deals with commerce is selling out. And this is particularly pronounced in music. Whereas talking to Reg, talking to Dave Faulkner from Hoodoo Gurus, talking to Paul Fenech, who's just walked in from Pizza, they want to have a big audience, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I was never a fan of, say, post-punk music, indie music that just wanted it to be held close to a tight little group and we know what's what and no one else does. So to me, that always looked a bit elitist. I liked, and in the book we show that heaps of music, courtesy of Countdown, After Dark, Night Moves, Rock Arena, did get airplay, thanks to Triple J in the late 70s, early 80s, 3RRR in Melbourne. These things seeped into the mainstream, and through comedy festivals, through all sorts of initiatives at the ABC, whether it was Race Around the World or Black Comedy more recently, were doing outreach, or the Aboriginal Indigenous Unit at the ABC. I think, Paul, you know those guys well. They were letting in all kinds of interesting people to do interesting work. So we look at why policy has not talked about these outreach initiatives, these things that mix it up. So generative hybridity is really just bringing together things that are frequently opposed. One, this notion of a pure culture or a pure economy. We say that a good economy is one that values culture, and we kind of seek to interrogate artists about what they want and how they make art. And they kind of talk about the tension, the creative tension of being in a small group and then moving into a mainstream group, whether it's Steve Izard and Andrew Denton talking about taking their crazy fringe work onto Channel 7 or the ABC, or bands that are suddenly doing big record deals. And they all say it was absolute warfare. It was complete tension and fights, but we got some great stuff done. And Dave Faulkner would say, it was kind of good getting out of the inner city and doing the western suburbs beer barns. It made us better. It was egalitarian. So we negotiate. So we're interested in the negotiation.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say briefly before I throw to Mark, and I'll come to you in a minute, Reg, of course, is that because Mark and Tony and I have talked a lot, worked a lot, and we're trying to still get projects up on why class matters, you know, because I said before, Tony's from the Gong, I'm from Newcastle. You know, and one of the things about class is working class is talked about in terms of deficit, like there's something wrong about being working class. Screw that, right? It's a source of rich humour. It's a source of culture. Paul Fenech's here. I don't need to sing to the choir, mate. I rewatched your work recently preparing for this and I love it. Thank you for your work, but that's kind of part of this, that the idea of high culture, low culture is just nonsense when you think about it. So, Mark, I want to ask you, the book's subtitle is After the Creative Industries. So creative industries is a bit of corporate speak to me. I've never liked the term. I don't like corporate speak. And the Labor governments, who have been good to the arts and culture industries at times. Relatively speaking, mate, yeah. Like what's missing in this kind of economic framing of culture? What are the alternatives?
Well, I suppose to put it simply, business needs something outside business to work. Needs some source of ideas of value outside simply economic value in order to sell things and to motivate people, inspire people and so on. So even looked at purely from the point of view of the economy, if you want to look at it in those terms, we need something other than the economy. And these subcultural fringe forms are a very important part of where that comes from. I suppose to pick up on, Catherine, on that earlier point you raised about romanticism, the romanticism about the niche and that idea that comes through the 70s. And certainly we do, as many people have, questioned that. But we also in the book are somewhat critical of the counter tendency and what we call anti-romanticism. And that is the tendency to say that, well, there's really nothing, or the independent or the fringe doesn't even really exist. There's only one thing, which is the mainstream economy. This is, one of the drivers of the creative industries idea was that even the most fringe artists are really kind of entrepreneurs. They're trying to get started. They're trying to join the economy and so on. And there's a truth to that. But one of the things we did also want to say was that there's something special about fringe locations and small cultures and these spheres in which people are speaking to their peers, to intimate audiences, people who they might know and recognise and provide kind of valuable response and input, not just by the product, but help to improve the quality through their responses. And so we wanted to kind of argue the value of those things and also the institutional infrastructure that enables them to happen, like universities or small bookshops, some of the things that Tony was mentioning before. And I think that one of the problems we see with the creative industries arguments is that they don't really do that. There's been a tendency to see really completely erase the distinction between the mainstream and the fringe and see them all just as one thing. And we wanted to restore the idea of the fringe or fringe independent avant-garde, there's a whole lot of terms you can use, as special crucibles where important things happen. And one of the things happened, they produced these ideas of value, which then can become important in business sense. It's not the only reason, but it can provide the basis for economic development. So business needs something other than business, and places where notions of cultural value are developed is really important part of where that comes from.
That's a great answer. And it also makes me think about something a joke I had with my husband mentioning that he was in the pram factory and he was telling me a story about he and Greg Pickhaver and a number of other people who were in the pram factory performing some Marxist 3 East Timor show at a meat workers and abattoir. And they discovered that the people they were singing the Internationale to were recent immigrants from escaping socialism. And I said, did you say, I'm here from Toorak and I'm here to help? Because one of the things about the fringe is that we know historically, and this is not a bad thing, is it often comes out of university reviews or, there's a class-based element. Mind you, working class humour, and this is where Tony and I have always connected, also has a rich history. So I want to go to Reg because Mental is anything, like you guys, I was lucky enough to go to the premiere of the doco on you guys. Everyone's got to see it. It's brilliant. So interesting. And you guys came out of art school from varying backgrounds and you emerged out of the inner city alternative scene and you won the suburbs over, man. You went to the burbs. You played beer barns. It's like, was it the band's larrikinism? How did you find those two very different audiences?
Well, it was a slow process. Hello, Paul. I had very small parts in a couple of Paul's shows. He's a very funny director. I mean, yeah, we were an art school band and our main ambition was to play at art school parties initially, and which we started doing. And then we got a residency in a local hotel in Paddington called the Unicorn, charging 50 cents a night and playing in the back room. And that soon became popular. And then so a year after that, we moved to the Civic Hotel in the centre of town and played there for a year or so as a residency every Thursday night. And that went really well. And by that time we thought, And we've been playing all our favourite covers from 60s bands and T-Rex back to the 50s, back to Elvis and earlier stuff, earlier country and blues. And so we had an eclectic range of music. And it was the start of the punk new wave era too. So every pub in the city had a band playing in it. So it was a great way for bands to train and learn and get going. But it was inner city. You rarely got out of the inner city. But as soon as we made our first record and we were fortunate enough to get onto Countdown, which means you get airplay, which then meant we had to get a manager and start touring nationally. So that's when we got out of the inner city into the suburbs, basically. Oh, plus, playing in regional areas, but most people in Australia live in the suburbs. So that's where you play. And a lot of our music and images were also about that.
I'm going to come back to Mark and Tony, but I want to follow up with this. I mean, obviously you and the guys the people managing you and working with you had to negotiate that crossover moment, right? So and you had international hits as well, you went huge. I mean, did you feel you ever had to compromise in the 80s and 90s to earn all those hits, or did you feel you were able to stick to your idiosyncratic vision, creatively? How hard was that?
We kind of stuck to our idiosyncratic vision. If we ever had a vision, I don't think we did. As Jim Blackfoot, our road manager, described us, he was astonished that we were the most ambitionless band he'd ever come across. But yeah, we did become popular. And in the 80s, in the music industry, there was a huge thing about production and drum machines and sequence stuff. And so there was pressure to do that. And we did that partly because, some of the band members liked that stuff, and particularly Greedy because he's a keyboard player. So he got that sort of gear early and could do all the parts on it and figure stuff out, and that was good. So we, in the mid to the late 80s, we were recording that kind of music, which was drum machines, and it had that sort of feel, but the songs were still essentially ours. But then, oddly enough, in the 90s, we went back to probably being more of a garage pop art school band again, and recording organically, fully, real drums, not so many machines and what have you. So you definitely, if you become popular and you're earning money, you're going to be compromised to some way, in some respect, no matter what art form it is.
Spiritually.
Well, we weren't spiritual at all, so that wasn't a problem. We were completely
One of the things we found in the book
blank.
Was quite often surprise people taking their work to broader audiences and coming out of niche environments to broader audiences, surprised at the audience response. That it was more as positive as it was. I don't know if that was the case with you, Reg, but one example was the Chaser, who were doing this weird stuff at Sydney Uni in their satirical magazine. They thought there was no way that anyone would be interested in this beyond their kind of cult following.
Yeah, they say make it weirder.
That's right.
Because the gatekeepers, the bad kind of gatekeepers, always underestimate, and they don't do research about it. They just say, oh no, you'll frighten them off. Yeah. And, that often going to a bigger audience, Catharine and I know this pretty weird shit goes down in the outer suburbs. It's interesting. And Paul Fenech, of course, knows that. So to think that you'll shock the mass audience and you can't be transgressive is wrong.
Well, you've got to remember too that, I come from a working class family and most of the mentals were working class, lower middle class, I guess. But we all listened to interesting music and read interesting books and listened to the goons on the radio or on TV. And so a lot of the culture you're absorbing, no matter what class you're in, it's interesting stuff and you appreciate it. So it's not hard for a suburban or rural audience to understand and enjoy and appreciate stuff that inner city people do or educated people do.
And that brings me, I'm going to a question that's meant to be at the end, but I'm going to come to it right now for a second, and then I'm going to go back to other questions. Now, this is me perhaps riding my own hobby horse, because I've just finished a book writing about this. We seem to be living through an era where arts funding bodies, writers' festivals, theatre companies, et cetera, the cultural czars, if we want to call them that, are beset by polarising political debates, resulting in a space of cancellations and reverse cancellations. And I'm wondering, are we witnessing a return to the romantic 70s idea of counterculture and revolution? Or, in relation to your book and what you found, on one hand, if you look at it economically, there are these bodies which are hyper-bureaucratic and corporate speaky who are terrified of doing the wrong thing or putting a foot wrong, right? And then you've got people who actually want to speak their mind and should be able to, in my view, and other people should be able to speak their own minds in return. But where are we in relation to the book you've written? I'm asking you guys, and Reg weigh in, about the relationship between the economic cultural value of industry thing and the 70s romantic idea of revolution.
Well, I think there's always been this purist tendency in kind of left-wing groups and left cultural groups. And yes, it is influenced by romanticism. But, I guess if you can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. And I've always seen the great side of bohemian groups. They often bring left and right-wing people like Norman Lindsay together with left-wing things. Norman Lindsay worked on left-wing newspapers, even though he hated Christianity and he hated socialists and mocked them all. I've got a picture of the group on my wall, and they all kind of have different political views, and they used to like taking the piss out of each other. And that's been one of the good things about bohemian groups. But you get those moments, and it happened in the 30s, 40s with the avant-garde in Melbourne. It often happens in Melbourne. Avant-garde in Melbourne and in some parts of the counterculture where they say, this is the correct line, and it comes from a certain...
Correct.
It's a certain view from Marx perhaps and other, but actually I date it to the sort of Puritans in England, which is this is the correct line. And also the Committee of Public Safety in the Russian Revolution will keep you safe. Whenever I hear that, I hear it in Daniel Andrews' voice because I now live in Melbourne, keeping you safe. But I don't want to be safe. I want to be physically safe because I'm a coward, but I don't want to be intellectually safe and I don't want to be culturally safe. And but a lot of people want that. Good on them. But I think that Bohemia's counterculture, subculture scenes, Fringe, is at its best when it's pluralist. It's kind of mixing up different groups, people from non-English speaking backgrounds, different social classes, and people are kind of offending each other within the group. And great stuff comes out of that. And when Mark and I talk about hybridity, hybrids are about bringing different things together. And so if it's all the same, it gets really tedious. You could go to a Fringe festival that would become not half as interesting as an Englishman's working club from Birmingham or something where they're telling mother-in-law jokes. So and I'm reminded of Whitlam's saying, of course, the impotent are always pure. And this puritanical streak, I think, is not helpful for art.
No, well, okay, I want to ask Mark a question then because, and this, it's great to have Paul in the audience because, when we think about, and what you're doing is challenging the idea of mainstream and fringe. It shouldn't be. And this is where class and culture matter to me, like growing up where I did in a very multicultural, 1960s, 70s Newcastle, post-war, everyone was a wog. And my parents were great because they just went, great, bring them round. Their mums have great recipes. And so I really kind of get that richness of that stuff. And in terms of comedy, Mark, why do you think people have been more accepting of what we might call crossover in comedy than in other areas? Accepting things like the mentals and so on. Comedy is a really interesting case in point here.
Yeah, if we talk about this in the comedy chapter in the book a bit, I suppose in summary you could say that comedy is a kind of dirty thing. There's never a purity about it. It's always transgressive and crossing boundaries and that kind of thing. And
do you mean smutty?
Well, it can be smutty, but even if it's not smutty, it's dirty in other senses, in the sense that it crosses boundaries, it transgresses, brings in elements from other places and so on. Unlike music is often one of the forms where people often think of it as pure, like there's a sort of oracular quality of that, those subcultural bands of the 70s and so on. That was often the way they were thought about, whereas comedy's not so much prone to being thought of in that kind of purified way, and that's what we were trying to get away from. So comedy is a nice example to work with to get up the kind of argument that we're trying to develop because it lends itself immediately to talking about these kind of movements from fringe to mainstream. So there have been ideas at certain times of like alternative comedy in a purer sense. So in Thatcher's Britain, there was the alternative comedy scene, but generally speaking, comedy is always doesn't fall into that trap so much of being seen as a kind of pure form. Yeah.
It accepts that its fringe is very marketable and can become popular. So the Edinburgh Fringe or the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, and people don't feel like, they don't say, you're selling out, which they tend to a bit more in music, I think. But, we've talked to people like Steve Vizard, Paul, the Doug Anthony All-Stars, and, they all saw themselves as kind of edgy and, they, came from Student Review, The Chaser as well, we spoke to. They come from that and go through kind of in Melbourne, which didn't have leagues clubs. They started performing in theatre restaurants. Think about places like Dracula's and those sort of things that they'd come in and put on a show. and started performing to the suburbs that would come to those shows, as Steve Izard said, for a rotten old piece of cake and not very chocolate ripple cake. But they got a nice night's entertainment and went home. And he said, we learned how to do what we did on Fast Forward by working with that audience. So we had all our avant-garde stuff, and I've seen photos of all of the Fast Forward people, the degen people, in their very avant-garde kind of fringe theatre world, which wasn't light years away from the Pram Factory, and then going into this practice that could work on the ABC and could work on Channel 7. And I think Steve says in the book, he was happy to be on Channel 7 because you're talking to the converted a bit on the ABC, and they developed a style which was clicking from between things. So if someone was offended or didn't like something, you move on really quickly to a bit of slapstick where you've had some really crazy stuff in the shot before. So we had a lot of fun with that comedy chapter because we engaged in this idea of the carnivalesque, which, Mark is very good at theorising. And I used it for my Barry McKenzie book, which is basically getting down and dirty and the vulgarity. We often use the metaphor of the brown eye. But, it's the idea of when the mob would have a day like the Festival of Fools, and for a day they could let off steam and mock the king and mock the bishop and be sacrilegious. And the comedic license comes from this idea. And, it's not from, that was in medieval Europe, but it was in Aristophanes. And so we talk about the carnivalesque in shows like Pizza and Housos or Barry McKenzie movies or Alvin Purple. And, this is in its own way revolutionary, but not like having a Marxist cadre coming to the barricades, kind of just using humour to destabilise authority and becomes a mode of democracy.
Also, all those humorous forms are a fantastic salve for people who are troubled or worried or frightened or having a boring crap or whatever.
Listen, every time I think my marriage is in peril, I listen to If You Leave Me, Can I Come Too? That's all I have to say.
Well, it's an instructive song. It's educational, that one.
I don't need a therapist to have that song.
Mental as anything as therapist. I love that.
Yeah, no, we're a very good social psychiatrist and therapist.
You should bulk bill.
Good idea. I mean, when you talk about, artists and musicians being embarrassed about earning a decent living, I've never had that problem. And as a child, I wanted to be I didn't know much about fine art, but I wanted to draw pictures. I wanted to do comics or do advertisements. So I was quite happy to be a commercial artist rather than a fine artist.
And that's a great segue to this. I mean, you're an amazing artist, much love. But, what's the countercultural, if you think there is one, and you can just say it's not, or the political DNA of a surfwear label like Mambo? You're involved in that with Dare and so on. And yet, I asked you this question, you wouldn't remember, but at the premiere of your doco the other night, I got up. I asked you about Dada and the influence on your work, because I love your work, and thank you for your work. What's it like being on one hand, an artist with a Dada surrealist kind of influence, but then working at that level with a brand?
Well, it was easy to work with Mambo because they just let you do whatever you wanted. There was no
more of that.
There was no instruction. There were no rules. That's partly why Mambo was popular. But you see, Mambo started off as a countercultural, independent, small thing, but then it became a big company and quite successful. And it was very cool with young people. But as soon as a lot of young people saw their big overweight uncles and fathers with Mambo stuff on at
they became that
at the family barbecue.
Uncle Peter in Newcastle.
I'm talking about young people. So the young people sort of started, and this is kind of after the Olympics. I think Mambo being involved in the Olympics might have made them think it was a little too credible or mainstream or something. But that's what happened, and so it became less popular because the cool young people weren't buying the stuff, just their uncles and fathers and aunties.
Dadwear.
So it became less popular, but it was an interesting cycle. That's fair enough, things come and go.
Now, I'm keeping an eye on the time because I think we need quite a few moments for questions. So I'm going to throw to Mark and Tony and say if there's anything else you want to add. Because I'm going to throw first to Paul, if he doesn't mind. Do you guys want to say something else that I haven't covered?
Well, just to say that we really value those things in a policy sense. And we got sort of 10 policy points at the end, which we basically are posted to Albo because they did this revive policy. And we had a lot of stuff about, yes, you're bringing those bloody quotas for Australian content, But items like every show that's publicly funded, every film, documentary should have the right to be on the ABC and SBS. You shouldn't have to pitch it, go begging. It's publicly funded. If it was good enough for that, it should be there. But we really want to emphasise those baffles, the things that protect fringe formations. And a lot of critical academics said, oh, well, the fringe is over. And I said, well, that sounds like Homer Simpson saying all the good music was recorded between 1968 and 1973. Homer Simpson's line. No, the fringe is alive. There you go. It's alive and well, and we interviewed lots of younger people in the show, and one great band, Royal Headache, and another great one, The Bloods. And Kath and Chris are here in the audience. We went to see that concert, and I was at every gig at the Trade Union Club for more years than I can remember, but I never saw a gig, except for Metals Anything, of course, better than that Royal Headache gig that night. You know, so it's alive and well and getting arrested. And there were fans on the fans spinning around. It was crazy. But the things that helped the fringe were those independent record companies, the dole, the infrastructure in universities that could be utilised, like the tin sheds where your film nips are getting bigger. And policy should focus on that infrastructure. And the other thing that's really important are those vectors like the Indigenous unit at the ABC or outreach, things that go out into fringe communities, fringe cultures, dangerous scenes, and bring it into the mainstream. That's what I'd like to leave people with.
And that's why you've got to read this book. Mark, do you want to say something?
Just briefly, I did want to say, I think it's quite hard to get the line out from the book in a punchy way. It's much easier to take polarised positions. So we talked before about the creative industries idea, and that got a lot of attention. It was a big policy debate. And then you have the counter to that, the argument against an economic perspective. And we have a erstwhile colleague, Justin O'Connor, who's been doing a big book tour with his book called Culture is Not an Industry. And it's kind of a very trenchant riposte to the creative industries idea. And he's wanting to say that culture is not an industry, and he's got a lot of notice for that. And it's quite easy to come out, I think, with a punchy line of that kind. But if you're trying to take a both sides thing and say, well, we've got to talk about the relation between these things, often people respond to it, oh, you're fence-sitting. You're sort of not taking a strong position either for the economy or for culture. And what Tony and I and our co-authors want to do in the book is say that if you care about the culture, you've got to care about the economy. If you care about the economy, you've got to care about the culture. It's both sides, but it's quite a difficult thing to come out with that line, but that's what we tried.
That's beautifully put. Reg?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, culture is apart from the economy, really. If there was no economy, if we were cavemen, we'd still have culture. We'd be culture is
You've got a song about that, I think.
Yeah, well,
something like it.
But I mean, obviously, you know, culture, it becomes economic if it's relatively successful, but a lot of it exists independently of the economy.
Oh, look, I mean, what can I say? My mid-20s son is a musician, and he opened for a band called Car Seat Headrest in Chicago. And I think they've run out of band names. I'll leave it there. And I want to now throw to the amazing Paul Fenech, do the honour of thonging me, mate. Oh, no, I shouldn't have asked for that because he will. I actually want to ask you, Paul, as a serious fan of your work, it's amazing what you've done, the way in which you were able to take your comedy and mainstream it using really upper middle class entities like SBS. You know, they're pretty captive, let's face it, to the upper middle class elite stuff. Can you say something about how you did it?
Well, look, first of all, thanks for including me in the book, and great to see Reg again. Reg was actually in the first comedy that I made at the ABC. It was called, I can't remember it. What was the name of it? Anyway, there you go. It's a long time ago. But I've always been very fond of Reg. But anyway, to answer your question, how did I do it? Geez, I wasn't really given many favours. I feel like I had to kind of work really hard at it. I was sort of just a little older than the 80s fringe. We've talked about all kind of 70s and 80s fringe kind of art culture. I was a little younger than all those guys when I was kind of pushing through. And I think I grew up with kind of, movies like, Rambo and Rocky. And the sort of like just keep pushing rock, keep pushing. Like, I didn't think there was much of an arts possibility for someone like me, really, in those organisations. So I just had to work hard, So if they gave me one job and they said no, I'd give them 10 suggestions. So that was my technique at the ABC anyway. And, I was lucky enough to work on all sorts of things as a producer before I became a kind of an on-screen performer. And, I was lucky enough to have an opportunity at SBS. But there's no real kind of quick answer to this. And I'm sure I don't want to hog the night by giving you a 10-hour blow-by-blow how I got to, sort of go from being fringe to famous, literally. But I always loved making stuff, and I initially wanted to be a filmmaker first. But when I was a kid, I wanted to be maybe an actor or performer, and I loved doing comedy and making people laugh. And then there was just a point where SBS wanted a kind of an Australian version of South Park, and I'd done so many bloody things, and I just never said no, and I just always kept, always just hammering everyone. I must have been the most annoying kind of producer in the ABC and SBS. But finally, I had a breakthrough success, and then I tried to make the most of every opportunity. And I've never had a manager or an agent, so it was literally all the decisions were my own, good and bad. And I think the one thing I did learn, though, as TV stuff gave me the opportunity then to do live comedy around the country. So I started meeting real people. And so for the last 25 years, and even from last 2 weeks ago, I was at the Smithfield RSL. So as a producer and a writer and a performer, you get a real gauge of where the country is, And it's interesting because, I always did have a great appreciation for the arts kind of growing up in the 80s, but I never felt like I really had the opportunity to interact with it like I think some of the people you've been speaking about, the other artists who came out of, arts projects really. And it's kind of bizarre the way everything is now as a creator, because it feels like it's going further and further away from human-inspired alternative art and all the sort of, as much as everyone's scared of AI and all that sort of stuff and the internet and the social media platforms, that's where the fringe is now, at least in comedy I'm talking about, I suppose, even in music. But the sad thing is there are so many cheats for young artists now, because you've got an app that it'll create the best song you've ever heard in like 10 seconds, and you just have to give it about 4 prompts. And AI is now creating kind of the most incredible imagery at the drop of a hat. It could be whether it's a still image or whether it's a moving image. So I didn't really answer your question, but we're living in interesting times. Great to see you, Reg, and thanks for having me in the book. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And let's open up for questions. Larry Meltzer, yes.
Governments are trying to dictate what culture should be instead of it growing organically from the streets during your period. So now we've got all these organisations dictating like night cultures, et cetera, and what does that breed? Not only that, the notion of political correctness, which drives me crazy, does that sort of lessen the value of culture? And in fact, as Tony was talking earlier, about the Norman Lindsay period where there were people from the left and the right, and they all together, that group, made culture, as opposed to being dictated now.
Just to give you a quick answer, then I'll hand over to Reg and Mark. I guess the government's at its best, or state governments, municipal and federal, when they enable and don't control and dictate. And the worst part of it is the funding applications. They're destructive and they turn everything into a kind of, it's all about economics, impacts and metrics. When we say after the creative industries, that's Mark and I having a go at that. It sees everything as, it doesn't understand the true value, just the cost of everything. And so government controlling is, I guess, what we oppose. We didn't mind that they made it really easy to get dole in the 70s, or that they created skill shares where you could go and borrow video equipment, or,
it was easier to be a young artist then, definitely.
Of course,
more
of the
so
infrastructure.
Than it is now.
Yeah, that's exactly Dave Faulkner's first clip for the Hoodoo Gurus. They went to Metro TV, and that's providing stuff. We like that idea rather than the dictating thing you're talking about. And it does come now with the safety, don't tell the children kind of line.
It kind of, in a way, it doesn't matter what the government is, what their opinion is, whether they're right wing or left wing or harsh or not. People or artists still tend to not listen to them, disbelieve them, or do the opposite, or complain about them in some way.
Well, that sounds like academic.
And it's the DIY thing. A guy that we interviewed, kind of self-identifying punk enabler in Newtown, once these bands get a bit successful, he says, leave me now. But he enables them, and he's very much in the DIY ethos, which was with the 60s countercultures, but also incredibly with punk. And I don't think that ever goes away. And, and you can do it with YouTube so easily now. And I think that's all fantastic. But, I fear the algorithm as well and the way it works. But I do think we're in a great age of DIY. It's just about curating and coming across it. And that's the thing the algorithm does. So you won't hear of things. We all used to hear of everything in the broadcast era, and, Countdown was pretty significant in that. We went through the song list they played, because we always said they never play the music we like. But when you go through every program, you find Meldrum or whoever programmed a lot of really crazy, interesting stuff, and After Dark and shows like that.
Yeah, that was a very unifying, focused thing for the country's young rock and roll music fans. Definitely, there's nothing like that now. And that really helped the bands too, because if they managed to get on Countdown, you got some radio airplay, then you could tour and sell records and sell concert tickets and exist, proceed.
Yeah, and rage was really important, like radical. Other questions? Hi there.
I just wanted to know, you've made this distinction between fringe and famous, and I just been thinking a lot lately about weird art, and I wanted to know your thoughts about Is it possible for art to still be subversive or transgressive and famous at the same time? Or by virtue, does it kind of lose its edginess once it reaches a wider audience and receives that kind of, like, not accessibility, but kind of, you know, it's known, it becomes part of like the discourse or whatever. Can it still be weird or strange?
It certainly changes. You know, moving from fringe to famous changing. But I would say, I think Tony would agree, that subversive elements can remain and innovative and interesting elements can remain. And that's, I suppose, the argument about hybridisation, that something survives from the fringe in its mainstream form. It's not erased by that, which is, I suppose, this goes back to my fence-sitting comment a bit, because people want you to come down hard one way or the other. Either it's lost its original meaning or it's the anti-romantic idea would be, well, the fringe is not a separate thing anyway, so it's always already commercial. It's always already kind of moving into the mainstream space, so there's nothing lost. There's that idea of some originary thing which is lost when it becomes mainstream is a false romantic idea. We want to kind of accept neither of those points of view, but it is a difficult one to communicate. We just keep on trying to do that.
It's a good question. And there are Elizabethan moments, you know, think about Shakespeare period, where the most popular stuff is also really good and transgressive, witches, murders, whatever, you know, because something is liked by a lot of people, people might like things that are transgressive and absolutely weird and often do. I don't think that it needs to be emptied of that. And I think we had a lot of things. What happens is something might be novel and new and different and transgressive, and then everyone gets used to it and it isn't. But then we have news cycles that someone like John Howard gets elected and all the boards of cultural institutions change, or it becomes boring after a while. A teacher of mine once said, remember, Tony, everything changes but the avant-garde. And what he was referring to is it becomes a cliche, the avant-garde itself. How many more urinals do we need to put into an art gallery? That we get used to these things, and there's nothing wrong with the new generation wanting to become Dadaists again and eat food off the road like a young Barry Humphries did and pretend to eat his own vomit. Or, you know, you need to keep doing that because we can become very nice again or very safe again, and then we need to go back to that.
Yeah, there's always going to be new ways of upsetting and irritating people, and I'm sure young people will continue to come up with them.
I trust you with Duchamp's legacy. Okay, final question, because I saw his hand up. I know we're wrapping up. John.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure if this is an exact question. I'm just not sure how to frame it, but it's kind of getting to it in terms of the relation to the government funding and also to avant-garde, is there a space for the fringe anyway at all anymore? Because both the destruction of the bohemian cities and also the fragmentation of media, that it's very, very difficult for fringe, for up-and-coming artists in any of the forms to actually become famous. And I work in music mainly, so in terms of music, it's very difficult to get a foot in anywhere for a number of reasons. One, the local reasons and venues and noise and property values and all those sorts of things. And then there's the streaming issues and how to get heard. And so that's another whole hurdle as well. So it's very difficult to be fringe because all you can ever really be is mainstream because that's all that's left. That's how it feels. I'm not sure if that's a valid thing here. So
I think it's difficult. It is more difficult to be fringe for all those reasons you said. I mean, in the 70s, you know, everything was different and it was easier to do that. Every pub had a band playing every night of the week, but that's not the case anymore because of the reasons you mentioned. So I think it definitely is harder to be fringe, particularly in the inner city, which is the most expensive in terms of real estate, renting and what have you.
What we lack, I think, are crucibles, like places where people of like mind can get together and share ideas in a relatively contained space. And so, you know, it's much easier in some ways to do a lot of things. Paul was talking about the AI. I mean, what you can do is incredible with the technology. You can create these things which would be unthinkable in the 70s in terms of what very, very quickly you can create something quite high production value. But what is lacking is that kind of human connection of people working through ideas and working with each other and bouncing ideas and putting up an idea, playing a riff or something, getting a response. What do you think of this? Or a comedy show where you go out and try something out and the audience responds in a relatively bounded, contained way. To me, I think that's a lot of what we lack. It's difficult because we don't want to be pessimists. We very much in the book didn't want to be pessimists. We want to kind of hold out possibility of people doing things, and there's a whole lot.
Sounds like you're for the humans.
There's a whole lot of examples we have of young people doing great stuff, you know, and I think that's there. It's very dangerous, particularly as you get older, to think, oh, the young kids, they're not doing anything these days. It's not like it used to be. But at the same time, balancing that against, I think, what you're saying, which is where it is difficult.
Auntie Donna got knocked back in an ABC outreach and they said, well, we just do it on a stage in Ballarat and we're going to put it on YouTube. And they created their own YouTube stage channel. But I only found out about them because my kids turned me onto them because, well, I'm not the biggest social media person in the world, but, you know, it's where your algorithm lands. But they became cultic, and then Netflix said they gave them a series. And then, of course, the ABC said, come back, you can do whatever you want because you've been authenticated overseas, as Barry Humphries would say, or Sandy Stone. And, you know, the affordances of that are enabling fringes, and they are in their own little filter bubbles. I say little. I found out my son has like 500,000 followers. I don't know how we ever rated that well on the ABC. You know, so there are things happening, but we don't know. It's not curated. There's no Bill Collins, no Molly, and there's no thing that makes us all know about it and talk about it at school. But now they are all talking about Auntie Donna at school. And there are a whole lot of other, I'm rung up all the time, usually News Limited affiliates, and wanting to interview me and say, oh, sketch comedy's dead. It just died. It was so great. It was great, but it is still great. It's just online, and there are Aussies doing it.
Well, this is a great conversation, and, you know, let me just say 6, 7. I'm in touch with the young people. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear from you guys, and thanks for the great questions, and thanks for coming.